The words ripped from his throat, raw and trembling with a rage so profound it felt like poison. The specimens, he hissed, the sound barely a whisper yet sharp enough to slice through the oppressive silence of the study. Are their viabilities proving satisfactory, Alexander? Is the yield optimization proceeding as planned? For a moment that stretched into an eternity, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, the story truly began, not in that opulent room high above the world, but far, far below, in the dregs of a city built on secrets and lies. The city of Neoverata was a living, breathing hierarchy, and its air was the first testament to its brutal stratification. Up in the apex districts, where the elite breathed easy, the atmosphere was a carefully curated cocktail of purified oxygen and the ghost of expensive, subtle fragrances, the very scent of untouchable power. Further down, in the sprawling mid-class sectors, the air carried a pragmatic, metallic tang, a blend of factory exhaust and city-mandated sterilizing agents. The constant, olfactory reminder of a life governed by production quotas and regulated compliance. But down in the scraps, the city's forgotten underbelly where Kenny called home, the air was a suffocating soup. It was a thick, complex miasma woven from the stench of rotting, uncollected refuse, the acrid bite of chemical runoff from clandestine workshops, the cloying, artificial sweetness of failing nutrient paste dispensers, the oppressive heat of too many bodies crammed into too little space, and permeating it all, the sharp, metallic flavor of absolute hopelessness. Part 1. The collision of worlds. The monolithic towers of the apex alphas, stark fortresses of concrete and darkened glass, clawed at a sky perpetually veiled in gray clouds. Their gleaming facades cast long, indifferent shadows down upon the tiered world below. Miles beneath their peaks, Kenny moved through the labyrinthine, crumbling arteries of the scraps. His slender frame navigated the dense crowds with a fluid, ghost-like familiarity born from a lifetime of mastering the art of being unseen. Clamped around his wrist was the dull, scratched polymer band that served as his brand, its lifeless gray surface screaming his status to a world that didn't care. Unlisted, unofficial, a rogue. Even worse, it lacked the faint, rhythmic pulse that signified a true Omega. Kenny's biology was a cruel joke. His Omega traits were muted, vestigial. His scent, instead of being a potent lure, was as subtle as old parchment and the memory of rain, and his heat cycles were so infrequent and weak they were practically non-existent. In a society that valued omegas for a single biological purpose, procreation, he was functionally useless. It was a curse that had, ironically, become his shield, allowing him to melt into the background, to be ignored by the predators, both official and otherwise, who hunted omegas for control or exploitation. His mission for the day was a simple data snatch in a mid-class commercial hub. It was a place where the air still held a faint, deceptive perfume of aspiration before it soured into the familiar despair of the scraps. Getting in was child's play. A stolen, high-protein nutrient bar was enough to buy the deliberate inattention of a lazy security guard. Years of dodging enforcer patrols and the ravenous gangs that stalked the lower levels had made his movements swift and silent. The target was a small, independent data broker whose security system was a pathetic joke against the custom-built hacking tools provided by Lyra. Kenny was the physical asset, the ghost in the machine tasked with infiltration, planting the data spike, and vanishing without a trace. He excelled at it. His slight build, his noiseless steps, his innate ability to read the subtle currents of a room. These were not talents, but survival skills forged in the crucible of necessity. He was crouched behind a stack of nutrient paste crates in a poorly lit service corridor, watching the small data spike Lyra had fashioned blink rhythmically as it greedily siphoned information from a nearby terminal. That's when the ambient hum of the commercial district shifted. It wasn't an abrupt silence that fell, but rather a subtle parting of the waters, a ripple of deference that spread through the crowd like a wave, followed by a collective, respectful hush. Kenny didn't need to look to understand. Only one presence could command such an instantaneous, instinctual reaction. An apex. He risked a glance, his eye pressed to a narrow gap between the dusty crates. And there he was, Alexander, an apex alpha in every sense of the word. The advanced biochip integrated into the skin of his wrist glowed with a potent, almost aggressive crimson light, broadcasting his status. He was a titan, standing nearly a full head taller than anyone in his vicinity. His very presence a gravitational force that bent space and attention around him. He wore a suit the color of a gathering storm, tailored with such precision that it hinted at the formidable physique it concealed, a body built for more than just appearing powerful. His features were chiseled, aristocratic, and his silver-gray eyes swept over the bustling concourse with an air of detached, almost bored appraisal. He moved with a lethal, fluid grace, a nervous-looking mid-beta aide trailing a step behind him, a perfect picture of subservience. Kenny had seen Apex Alphas before, of course, on the omnipresent public broadcasts or as distant, untouchable figures, but never this close. The sheer, overwhelming pressure of his proximity was a physical shock. It was more than just the visual cues of his wealth and status. It was a primal, biological broadcast that made the fine hairs on Kenny's arms stand on end. It was a deep, ancient instinct buried within his muted Omega biology, a cellular recognition of a dominant, a leader. For one dizzying, unwelcome moment, Kenny felt a strange, tidal pull deep in his gut, a flutter of something he refused to name. He crushed the feeling ruthlessly, his jaw tightening. Awe was a luxury the scraps could not afford, and admiration for an apex was a betrayal of his entire existence. Alexander's gaze, continuing its casual, authoritative sweep of the area, snagged on the faint shadow Kenny cast. Perhaps it was the Omega's absolute stillness in the periphery of his vision. Or maybe an infinitesimal shift in the recycled air currents that carried the barest trace of Kenny's unique scent so faint. So unlike the heady, fertile fragrances of the Omega's Alexander was accustomed to. Their eyes locked. Alexander's cool, observant expression didn't waver. Yet Kenny felt utterly transfixed, pinned and dissected like a specimen under a microscope. A flicker of something moved in the depths of those silver eyes. Not surprise, precisely, but a sudden, focused interest. It was unreadable and deeply unsettling. Fueled by a sudden, desperate surge of scraps-born defiance, Kenny held that gaze for a fraction of a second longer than was safe, a spark of challenge igniting in his own tired, wary eyes. Then he broke contact, ducking his head and melting back completely into the service corridor's gloom. The data tool on the terminal flashed a solid green. Mission complete. With his heart hammering against his ribs, not just from the thrill of the heist but from that bizarre, jolting encounter, he vanished into the city's underbelly. Alexander completed his inspection, his mid-beta aide murmuring statistics about sector productivity into his ear. But the image of the low-class individual remained imprinted on his mind. An Omega his senses had confirmed, but a peculiar one. One with a scent like faint rain on old dust and eyes that held not a trace of submission, only a weary, defiant challenge. Intriguing. Most from the lower sectors, especially Omegas, would sooner stare into the sun than meet his gaze so directly. Back in the foul-smelling warren of the scraps, Kenny found his crew in their den, a collapsed residential unit they had fortified with scavenged durasteel plating and polymer struts. The space was illuminated by the unsteady, flickering glow of jury-rigged chemical lamps. Jax, a bundle of raw nerves and volatile temper, was in a heated argument with a scrap merchant over the value of a bundle of corroded copper wiring. Lyra, her fingers dancing across the screen of a salvaged datapad, was running diagnostics on a newly acquired, slightly singed surveillance drone. Zev, a mountain of quiet strength and unwavering loyalty, was meticulously mending a tear in their shared thermal blanket. "What?" Jack snapped, his argument forgotten as soon as Kenny slipped through the makeshift door. "You look like you've seen a damn ghost." Kenny tossed a CR chip, heavy with the proceeds from the data theft, onto their cluttered table. "Job's done. And I almost stumbled right into an apex." He grabbed a canteen and took a long swig of the cloudy, purified water. Lyra's head shot up, her usual intense focus shattered for a moment. An apex? All the way down in a mid-commercial zone? What was he doing there? They never come down this far unless it's for a formal inspection, and those are always pre-announced. Inspecting, I guess. Projecting power. Kenny couldn't shake the image of Alexander. The unnerving biological pull. The cold, analytical weight of those silver eyes. He described the Alpha in detail, the crimson ID, the palpable aura of absolute authority that seemed to bend the very air around him. He meant it as a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the untouchable gods who ruled from above, of the unbridgeable chasm that separated their worlds. But Jax, his eyes igniting with a familiar, reckless gleam, heard something entirely different. An apex, virtually alone in mid-commercial? That's not just a threat, Kenny, that's an opportunity. Priceless one. Think about the tech he must have on him. The access codes on his personal comm unit. His biochip ID alone would fetch a king's ransom on the black market. One score like that, he flashed a hungry, predatory grin. We could buy our way out of this shithole for good. Don't be a moron, Jax. Kenny shot back, a cold dread coiling in his stomach at the sheer insanity of the idea. Remember what that one mid-alpha enforcer did to your arm last month when you just tried to lift a single ration pack? An apex would just have to look at us and we'd be red mist on the pavement. We're talking about a completely different species. Not if we're clever, Lyra interjected, her voice quiet but firm. The allure of a life-changing payday and the irresistible technical challenge were already overriding her natural caution. Her eyes narrowed in concentration. They're powerful, yes, but they're still biological. The element of surprise, a moment of disorientation, a localized EMP targeted at his personal tech, maybe a sonic disruptor. We could jam his comms, grab what we can, and be gone before he can even call for backup. She was already sketching on her datapad, her fingers flying as she mapped out potential ambush points in the commercial hub based on Kenny's description. Kenny argued against it, his voice laced with a desperate passion. It was a suicide mission. They were scavengers, their survival predicated on staying small, on staying beneath the notice of the powerful. Their typical targets were low-level criminals or poorly secured supply depots. An Apex Alpha was a demigod by comparison, wrapped in layers of visible and invisible technology and authority. But his words were lost in the wind. Jax was already high on the fantasy, painting vivid pictures of their escape from the slums. Of real food that didn't come in paste form, of a life free from the constant fear of looking over their shoulders. Zev, ever loyal to Jax and weary beyond words of their hand-to-mouth existence, nodded in quiet agreement, his silent resolve a powerful force against Kenny's anxious protests. Lyra, already lost in the intricate puzzle of it all, was devising a multi-stage plan involving EMP bursts and sonic grenades cobbled together from scrap tech she had liberated over the past few months. Against his own screaming instincts, worn down by their collective desperation and a small, treacherous part of himself that dared to whisper what if, Kenny found himself dragged into their insane scheme. His intimate knowledge of the mid-commercial sector's layout and his ability to move like a shadow were essential to their plan. He told himself he was participating only to mitigate the disaster, to ensure his friends didn't get themselves vaporized instantly, to be the lone voice of reason in a chorus of madness. But a deeper, unacknowledged part of him felt a morbid compulsion. A strange curiosity to see that powerful alpha up close one more time, even under the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. The robbery attempt was, just as Kenny had secretly and grimly predicted, an unmitigated catastrophe. They had chosen a less trafficked service corridor that Lyra's hasty and dangerous surveillance suggested Alexander used as a shortcut. Jax, fueled by a cocktail of adrenaline and cheap stimulants, broke cover too early, shouting a clumsy, half-formed threat. Zev fired a short burst from his stun rifle, but the energy bolts splashed harmlessly, like pebbles against a fortress wall, off a shimmering kinetic shield that materialized instantly around Alexander. Lyra's remotely triggered EMP went off with a pathetic fizzle, utterly useless against the Alpha's advanced, military-grade personal shielding. Alexander didn't even seem surprised. He looked inconvenienced. He moved with a speed and lethal precision that was both terrifying and, in its own brutal way, beautiful. In one fluid, contemptuous motion, Jax's weapon was sent clattering across the floor, and Jax himself was on the ground, gasping for air with cracked ribs from a single, precise strike to his solar plexus. With another movement, Zev was disarmed and neutralized, his rifle twisted into a useless pretzel by Alexander's bare hands. Lyra, turning to flee, found her path blocked by the Alpha, who simply plucked the datapad from her numb, trembling fingers, his expression a mask of cold indifference. He didn't raise his voice, didn't rage. His actions were economical, efficient, and utterly devastating. A masterclass in effortless superiority. Kenny, who had been positioned as a lookout and escape coordinator, watched the disaster unfold in horrified slow motion from his hiding spot behind a stack of empty shipping containers. He saw the exact moment Alexander's gaze, as cold and sharp as chipped ice, swept over the corridor and locked onto his position. There was no point in running. He was caught. Mid-class detention was a circle of hell Kenny knew all too well, but this time felt infinitely worse. It was cold, damp, and suffused with a palpable brutality. The guards were bored alphas and resentful betas, all nursing chips on their shoulders and eager to exercise their meager power over prisoners from the scraps. Jax was curled in a corner, moaning and clutching his bruised ribs. Lyra was withdrawn, her body shaking as she stared blankly at a grime-caked wall. Zev endured his injuries with stoic silence, his face a mask of bruised pride. Kenny, to his surprise, was largely left alone after the initial rough processing. He was shoved into a separate, slightly cleaner cell. A guard had sneered at him, The apex wants a personal word with this one. Kenny's blood ran cold. He figured Alexander had singled him out for some special, private punishment. Fear, sharp and twisting, tightened its grip on his gut. Hours later, long after a watery, tasteless gruel had been shoved through the food slot in his cell door, the door hissed open. It wasn't a guard. It was a beta woman dressed in a severe, impeccably pressed, high-class domestic uniform. Her ID band glowed a soft, subservient blue. Alara. Her face was a study in professional composure, her intelligent eyes missing nothing. Alexander of House Goldian requires your presence. Omega Kenny. She spoke with a calm, neutral tone that offered no comfort. Your associates will be processed and released under standard mid-class ordinances for petty theft and public disturbance. A remarkably lenient outcome given the circumstances. Lenient because Alexander had willed it so. A chill that had nothing to do with the damp concrete of the cell crept down Kenny's spine. This wasn't about justice. This was about possession. He was being claimed. Under the wide-eyed, terrified stares of Jax, Lyra, and Zev, he was led out of the detention block and into an armored, unmarked luxury transport. The vehicle purred silently through the city streets, climbing ever higher, leaving the grit and grime of the mid-class sector far below until they finally breached the rarefied, sterile atmosphere of the apex districts. Alexander's residence was less a home than it was a modern fortress, a stark masterpiece of sharp angles, dark reflective glass, and overwhelming scale. Its automated defense systems were subtly visible as faint ripples in the air or the low hum of energy signatures. The air inside was cool and still, scented with something indefinably clean and complex. A fragrance that spoke of a level of wealth so vast it was almost abstract. Kenny felt as though he had been abducted and transported to another world. Part 2. A glimpse behind the veil. Alexander was waiting for him in a vast, minimalist chamber that felt more like a high-tech command center or a private art gallery than a living room. An entire wall was a panoramic window, displaying the glittering, stratified city below. From this height, the scraps were just a distant, hazy smudge on the horizon, easily ignored. He was dressed in simple, dark clothing made from some expensive, unfamiliar fabric that did nothing to diminish his formidable presence. He stood by the window, observing his domain, then turned as Alara escorted Kenny into the room. Omega Kenny, he said, his voice a low baritone that resonated in the cavernous space, completely devoid of discernible emotion. Your attempt to rob me was ambitious and predictably foolish. Kenny remained silent, meeting the Alpha's intense gaze with a defiance he didn't entirely feel, his heart still beating a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Suspicion, sharp and bitter, coiled in his gut. What could this apex possibly want with him? Ordinarily, Alexander continued, beginning to circle him slowly, like a predator studying a curious new form of prey, his movements fluid and deliberate. Individuals such as you and your associates would face severe consequences. Prolonged detention in the labor camps, perhaps forced enlistment in off-world mining operations. Something worse, depending on the presiding magistrate's mood. He paused, his silver eyes boring into Kenny. However, your unusual qualities have piqued my interest. My qualities? Kenny finally found his voice, though it came out rough and dry from fear. You mean my talent for leading my friends into a moronic trap and failing spectacularly to rob an apex? A flicker of his usual scraps-honed sarcasm broke through his terror. The barest ghost of a smile, so faint it might have been a trick of the light, touched Alexander's lips. Your resourcefulness in even conceiving of the attempt, however flawed its execution. Your ability to navigate the underbelly of this city, to survive in conditions my class can scarcely comprehend. Your scent. He paused again, closer now. Or rather, the lack of it. You are an anomaly, Kenny. Most Omegas, even those from the lower classes, possess a far more pronounced biological presence. He stopped directly in front of him. I have a proposition for you. A job, you could call it. I wish to understand the scraps. Not through the filtered, sanitized reports I receive from mid-class bureaucrats and sociologists, but the raw, unfiltered reality. I want you to teach me. Kenny stared, momentarily rendered speechless. Teach you? An apex? Why? So you can discover more efficient methods of oppressing us? Fine-tune your mechanisms of control? My motivations are my own and are not your concern, Alexander stated flatly, his expression once again unreadable. You will be housed here. You will be provided for food, shelter, medical attention. A standard of living far exceeding anything you could hope for in the scraps or any detention facility. In return, you will answer my questions. You will share your insights into your world. Refusal means I return you to the mercy of the mid-class enforcers. And the leniency currently being extended to your friends might be swiftly reconsidered. It was an offer wrapped in a threat, a gilded cage with an open door that led straight off a cliff. Kenny's mind raced. Escape from this fortress was impossible. Refusing meant a bleak, brutal future for himself and certain doom for Jax, Lyra, and Zev. But to accept, it felt like the ultimate betrayal. And yet, a small, pragmatic voice in the back of his mind whispered that this could be an opportunity. A chance to study the apex, to learn his weaknesses, perhaps even to gather intelligence that could one day be used against him. And if I agree, Kenny asked, his voice tight with suppressed anger, what are the terms? You will be treated with civility. You will be granted access to certain areas of this residence. You will not attempt to escape or access any restricted systems. Alara will see to your needs. Alexander's gaze was piercing, leaving no room for negotiation. Do we have an understanding? Kenny swallowed, the taste of resentment like acid in his throat. Fine, he bit out. I'll be your personal scraps tour guide, but don't expect me to enjoy it, or to ever trust you. I expect competence and honesty in your answers, Omega. Nothing more. Alexander gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Alara, who then gestured for Kenny to follow her. Thus began their strange, tense cohabitation. Kenny was given quarters that were larger and more luxurious than any 3 units in the scraps combined, complete with a private sanitation facility and a nutrient dispenser that offered an astonishing variety of actual flavors. Yet, it felt more confining than his detention cell. The profound silence was unnerving, the clean air too sterile, too lifeless. Alara, Alexander's ever-present beta attendant, saw to his basic needs with a silent, almost invisible efficiency. She was a ghost in the opulent machine of the household, her loyalty to Alexander absolute and unquestioning. Yet, sometimes, Kenny would catch a fleeting, unreadable expression in her observant eyes as she delivered his meals or a fresh set of clean clothes. Was it curiosity? Pity? It was impossible to tell. The tension between Kenny and Alexander was a constant, palpable force. It vibrated in the sterile air of the Apex residence, a dissonant chord composed of generations of class hatred, deep-seated mistrust, and a fiercely denied, deeply buried spark of something else, a grudging, unwilling awareness of each other that was far too complex to be simple attraction. Alexander was an enigma Kenny couldn't begin to solve. He was the embodiment of the oppressive system that starved the scraps, yet he treated Kenny not with the overt cruelty he had expected, but with a detached, analytical curiosity that was almost more unnerving. He was a scientist studying a new specimen, and Kenny was the specimen. Their lessons were held in Alexander's vast, sterile study, surrounded by holographic displays and data interfaces. "Tell me about the black market economy in the scraps," Alexander would command, his voice neutral, as he gestured for Kenny to sit on a chair that was almost sinfully comfortable, a stark contrast to the hard benches of the detention center. Kenny, his voice often laced with a bitter sarcasm, would describe the desperate, intricate dance of bartering for scraps of medicine or a day's worth of food. He spoke of the makeshift stalls hidden away in crumbling ruins, the constant threat of enforcer raids and gang shakedowns. He explained the plight of the recessives like himself, omegas with diminished traits who were shunned by alphas seeking fertile mates and often viewed with suspicion by other omegas as bad luck or a drain on scarce resources. He described the rogue communities that operated entirely off the official grid, surviving on a combination of ingenuity, defiance, and a fierce, fragile loyalty to one another. He recounted the hushed, terrified whispers of omegas who simply vanished, not just from the scraps, but occasionally from the mid-class districts as well, spirited away for unknown, terrifying purposes that fueled the darkest rumors. Alexander listened, his silver eyes never leaving Kenny's face, absorbing every word, every nuance. He would occasionally input notes into a datapad with elegant, precise movements of his fingers. He asked probing, intelligent questions, not about methods of control as Kenny had first suspected, but about the unwritten social contracts, the power dynamics between various scrap factions, the loyalties that bound crews and families together, and the small, daily acts of rebellion, creativity, and kindness that allowed a community to endure unimaginable hardship. He seemed genuinely fascinated by the mechanics of their survival. In turn, Alexander, whether deliberately or inadvertently, began to expose Kenny to the inner workings of high-class life. He would sometimes require Kenny to accompany him on observational tours to sanitized, high-security industrial zones where automated systems performed most of the labor, or to vast governmental archives filled with detailed data on every registered citizen. These were places a person from the scraps could never even dream of seeing, gleaming with advanced technology and run with a cold, terrifying efficiency. Kenny saw the immense, intricate machinery of power that maintained the city's rigid stratification, the sheer, overwhelming resources that the Apex Alphas had at their command. He also witnessed the casual, ingrained arrogance of the other Apex Alphas Alexander occasionally interacted with. Their undisguised contempt for anything and anyone they deemed lesser was a constant, chilling reminder of his host's origins and the world he represented. And yet, Alexander was different from them. He possessed the same inherent aura of command, the same unshakable belief in his own superiority, but the rigid, dogmatic certainty Kenny had expected seemed less absolute in him. There was an intellectual curiosity, a searching quality to his inquiries that went far beyond mere intelligence gathering for the state. He seemed to be trying to understand something fundamental, something that his sterile reports and data streams could never provide. The confusing awareness between them continued to smolder, despite everything. Kenny hated himself for it. He hated the way his senses sometimes sharpened when Alexander unexpectedly entered a room, the traitorous flutter in his chest when their hands accidentally brushed while examining a data schematic Alexander was explaining. He told himself it was just a survival instinct, a hyper-awareness of a potential threat. Alexander, for his part, remained impeccably controlled, his interactions almost entirely formal. Yet, Kenny would sometimes catch him watching when he thought he wasn't being observed, a strange, calculating intensity in his gaze that made Kenny's skin prickle and his defenses flare. Was he still just a specimen, or was there something more in that look? One bleak, rainy evening, with the city lights blurring into abstract streaks against the study's panoramic window, Kenny felt particularly restless, caged, and useless. Alexander was in a sealed-off communication room, engaged in a hushed, encrypted conversation. Kenny had caught fragments of the conversation before the door had sealed. Phrases like specimen viability, genetic drift, and yield optimization. The cold, clinical terminology snagged Kenny's attention, sending an uneasy shiver down his spine. Over the weeks, he had become adept at mentally mapping the residence's non-public corridors during his limited, Alaire-supervised explorations, driven by a desperate need to understand his prison, to find any potential weakness. His curiosity, a trait that had often gotten him into trouble in the scraps, finally got the better of him. He knew Alexander would be occupied for some time. Slipping out of his own quarters, he moved silently through the opulent, empty hallways. He found himself in a rarely used service corridor near Alexander's private laboratories, areas Alaire had subtly but firmly warned him were strictly off-limits. A faint, low-frequency hum emanated from behind a reinforced steel door, one that wasn't on any of the public schematics he had managed to glimpse. It was secured by a sophisticated biometric scanner, far beyond his ability to bypass. But he didn't need to open it. Adjacent to the door, almost invisible against the dark wall paneling, was a small maintenance access panel, left a fraction of an inch ajar, likely an oversight by a careless technician. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. Peering through the narrow gap, he saw not a storeroom or a utility closet, but the interior of a silent, high-speed lift, its destination indicator dark. And on a discarded datapad lying on a small ledge just inside the panel, apparently forgotten, its screen still dimly glowing, was a single horrifying image. A sterile, brightly lit chamber, filled with rows upon rows of transparent stasis tubes. Within them were pale, unconscious figures, Omegas, young and old, male and female, all with the telltale, faint biological glow of fertile potential. But their faces were slack, lifeless, their bodies entangled in a web of wires and tubes connecting them to humming machinery. Below the image, a line of stark, clinical text burned itself into his memory. Batch 73 Viability Assessment, Suboptimal. Low implantation success rate. Recommend culling and recalibration of nutrient supply for batch 74. Increase hormone supplements for prime specimens. The air rushed from Kenny's lungs as if he'd been physically struck. Culling. Specimens. Breeding. The dark rumors weren't just rumors. They were farming Omegas. Genetically enhancing them, experimenting on them, and culling the suboptimal ones, all in the name of breeding more superior alphas, of maintaining their genetic purity and their grip on power. The whispers from the scraps, the disappearing Omegas, Alexander's clinical questions about Omega biology. It all clicked into place with a sickening, horrifying clarity. This was the Apex Alpha's darkest, most vital secret, the rotten, festering foundation upon which their glittering towers were built. And Alexander, his host, his student, the Alpha who had shown fleeting glimpses of something beyond cold calculation, was an integral part of it all. The realization hit Kenny with the force of a physical blow, cold and sharp, stealing his breath and leaving behind a burning, visceral disgust that threatened to consume him whole. Part 3. The unveiling. Kenny felt like he was moving through a waking nightmare. The image of the captive Omegas was seared onto the inside of his eyelids. The opulent splendor of Alexander's residence, once merely alien and intimidating, now seemed grotesque, obscene, a monument built on a foundation of unimaginable, systematic suffering. He waited, trembling with a mixture of pure rage and abject horror, until Alexander finally emerged from his communications room. The Alpha's expression was thoughtful, almost distant, as if he were contemplating a complex set of data. Then Kenny spoke, his voice cutting through the quiet of the study. He saw Alexander still instantly, all distant thought vanishing, replaced by an immediate piercing alertness. The Alpha's head snapped towards him. You were not authorized to be in that sector. How did you gain access? His voice was dangerously low, a coiled threat. Authorized? Kenny laughed, a harsh, broken sound that echoed strangely in the luxurious room. Were they authorized to be turned into living incubators? To be treated like cattle for your superior race? All those questions. You weren't trying to understand us. You were just gathering data for your farm. Every word was laced with venom. For a long moment, Alexander simply stared at him, his silver eyes unreadable. Kenny expected denial, rage, a swift and brutal punishment. Instead, the Alpha's shoulders slumped, just a fraction, a barely perceptible sign of immense weariness. What you saw is the reason I brought you here, he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual command. It is the project I have been fighting to dismantle from the inside for the last 5 years. Kenny froze, the torrent of accusations dying on his lips. Disbelief warred with the raw certainty of what he had seen. Fighting? You're the head of House Goldian. You're one of them. This project is the source of your power. This project, known as the Legacy Program, is a perversion, an obsession led by a council of Apex elders, including my own father, Alexander explained, his voice tight with a long-suppressed bitterness. They are terrified of genetic degradation, of losing their dominance. They believe this is the only way to secure our future. I believe it will be our damnation. I have been working against them, sabotaging data, redirecting resources, faking failures, but it's like trying to stop a tidal wave with a bucket. And me? Kenny asked, his voice shaking. Why me? Because you are the proof that their premise is flawed, Alexander said, taking a step closer. You are an Omega who is, by their standards, genetically useless. You have no value to their breeding program. You are an anomaly they would disregard, which makes you the only person in this city I could potentially trust. I wasn't gathering data to improve their farm, Kenny. I was gathering data to build a case against it, to understand the lives they are so willing to sacrifice. Before Kenny could process this staggering revelation, a shrill alarm blared through the residence, its piercing cry accompanied by flashing red emergency lights. Security breach. Sector Gamma. Unauthorized access detected. A cold, automated voice announced. Alexander's head whipped towards the study door. They know, he said, his voice grim. Someone was monitoring you. Or me. It doesn't matter. We have to go. Now. Just as he spoke, the study door was blasted inwards, sending shrapnel flying. 2 heavily armored enforcers, their uniforms bearing the crest of the Apex High Council, not the standard city patrol, stormed into the room, their weapons raised. But before they could fire, Ilera, the quiet, subservient Beta, moved with a speed and precision that defied her unassuming appearance. A small, silvery device flew from her hand, attaching itself to the lead enforcer's helmet with a magnetic click and emitting a high-frequency pulse that sent him crashing to the floor, convulsing. She ducked behind a console, pulling a concealed energy pistol from a hidden holster and laying down covering fire. "The escape route is ready, sir," she said, her voice as calm and professional as if she were announcing dinner. "As you instructed." The next few minutes were a blur of chaos and adrenaline. Alexander, moving with the deadly grace Kenny had witnessed before, disarmed the second enforcer and shoved Kenny towards a hidden panel in the wall. They plunged into a dark, narrow service tunnel, the sound of weapons fire echoing behind them. They ran, their footsteps clattering on the metal grating, following Ilera through a maze of passages Kenny never knew existed. They finally emerged into a subterranean transport hub, where a sleek, unmarked speeder waited for them. They piled in, and Ilera expertly piloted the vehicle into the city's deep-level traffic, vanishing among the countless streams of transports. They descended, leaving the clean, orderly world of the Apex districts behind, plunging back into the grit and chaos of the lower levels, finally coming to a stop in a derelict, forgotten corner of the scraps. The safe house was a reinforced, hidden bunker beneath a collapsed warehouse, a place of stark functionality, a world away from Alexander's opulent prison. The silence in the bunker was thick with unspoken questions and the aftershocks of their escape. Kenny looked at Alexander, the Apex Alpha, now a fugitive in the very slums he had once studied from an impossible height. He was no longer a captor, no longer a scientist studying a specimen. He was an ally, a reluctant, dangerous, and utterly unpredictable one. Their worlds had not just collided. They had shattered and fused together in the crucible of a shared, terrible secret. The fight for their own survival and for the lives of the captive Omegas had just begun. The glittering city of Neoverata loomed above them, a monument to a corrupt power they had just sworn to tear down, piece by piece. The foundation of their relationship was built on a lie, a kidnapping, and a galaxy of mistrust. Now, stripped of their former roles, all they had was a shared enemy and a desperate, fragile alliance. Do you think a bond forged in betrayal and desperation can ever truly become one of trust? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey into the dark heart of Neoverata, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories.